Hello, and welcome to Sustain, a podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Who made this road that we're driving on? Anyway, before we get going, I want to make sure you know who I am. I'm Richard Littauer, your host today. Hello, everyone. And I'm joined today by our awesome guest, Emmy Tsang. Emmy, how are you doing?
I am doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Richard. And hi, everyone listening to the podcast.
Emmy is the engagement lead at Invest in Open Infrastructure. She's calling in today from Utrecht in the Netherlands. And I'm very excited about this one. We've had Caitlin Taney on before. Caitlin Taney is the executive director of IOI, not to be confused with Innovative Online Industries from Ready Player One, which is a very different evil megacorp. Invest in Open Infrastructure is actually really awesome. Emmy, can you tell us a bit more about what you do?
Thanks, Richard. Oh, I did not know that there's another IOI that is a mega evil corp. So that's good new knowledge for me. We are, as Richard said, we hope we're doing some awesome work. We think that we're doing some important work. We are a nonprofit initiative working to increase the investment in and the adoption of open infrastructure, primarily to further equitable access to and participation in research. And we do this in a couple of ways. First, we provide actionable evidence-based tools and recommendations for decision makers who are trying to decide whether they're going to use open infrastructure or invest in open infrastructure. We also offer tailored strategic support to infrastructure services and funders in the space. And last but not least, we run funding pilots to try and see how we can work together with other stakeholders and groups in the space to catalyze additional investment in open infrastructure, which we believe is really much needed.
So as the engagement coordinator, you're doing a lot of that communication and building engagement strategies work. You also do a lot of community design. That's cool. Just making sure I place you right. How big is IOI in general? How many people do you have? You're soft money funded, right?
We are currently 10 people. That's actually quite recent. We have 2 new team members who joined in the last 2 weeks. So it's a really exciting time for us as the team grows. The team members are kind of across the world, across the US, Europe, and Africa. So we do have a global team, which is something that I think is quite unique about IOI as well, because we do have this sort of more global perspective when looking at infrastructure and looking at funding. And we are funded by a combination of philanthropies, institutions, library coalitions. We're fiscally sponsored by Code for Science and Society, which is a 501c3 or a charity registered in the US. And we are really grateful, and that's a big part of my work as engagement lead as well. We're very grateful to be supported by and situated in the center of sort of a coalition, big community of different stakeholders, from funders of open to institutions and libraries to research and education network, people who care about digital public goods and connectivity, open source, open infrastructure service providers are a huge important part of our work and also participates really actively in a lot of the products, the tools, the recommendations that we develop together. So yeah, it's really just fantastic to be supported by so many and to work with and learn from so many.
So we're 14 minutes into the call and open source finally got mentioned. When we're talking about open infrastructure, we're talking about rotundas, ballparks, tennis courts, right? Like, what do you mean by open infrastructure in general, and how is it related to open source?
Absolutely. This is, I feel like the $1 billion question here and a really good one as well. And here, I think it's where we, over the years, I'd say have sort of acquired I want to say nuance and intentional understanding of what open infrastructure may be. We find it easy often to put sort of infrastructures or technologies into very clear binaries, right? Either open or not open. Some folks think about open being nonprofit or commercial or proprietary, et cetera, et cetera. But as we interact with and engage with and are in conversation with more and more different stakeholders, those who are using infrastructure, those who are building infrastructure, we realize that actually most of the time these binaries don't really make sense. It's very, very contextual when it comes to what open is and what infrastructure is. I know that I'm not giving you or anyone here a straight answer at this point because it is so nuanced and so complex. And so what I can say right now is that for some of the new products and reports that we're launching or just launched, we're primarily considering open technologies that are enabling the sharing of research, data, and content. For example, that is our focus when it comes to thinking about infrastructure that's enabling the equitable access to and participation in research and scholarship. We do have a list of sort of 5 criteria that we're considering when it comes to what open infrastructure is. And that covers a range from technologies that meet the definition of open source software, to being free to use by users, to distributing or exclusively distributing openly licensed content. And the thinking behind that is that we don't want to say you're only open if you meet all of these 5 criteria. We'd like to prioritize and focus our energy and efforts on technologies that or services that are meeting at least one of the 5 criteria. And the other thing is that just because you don't meet any criteria right now, or you only meet 1 or 2 of them, it doesn't mean that you are bad or you're then not open, right? What we want to do is to encourage services and infrastructures to move towards sort of more value aligned, more openness that is meaningful for them and the communities that they serve. So in short, we're viewing open infrastructure more of as a spectrum because of so many of the conversations and communities that we've been embedded within, that it just is impractical and exclusionary almost to say that open is this definition and that's how it's defined.
That makes sense to me from an open perspective. Lord knows I spent many of these podcasts railing against the OSI while also being like the OSI is great. It's very, very difficult to define what is open, what isn't open. Being able to include a larger nuance allows more people to be at the table. It also makes it more difficult to prevent some things like open washing. We've covered all that in depth on this podcast and other places. What we haven't always covered is infrastructure being a similar word. Obviously, as in my horrible throwaway gag earlier, roads and bridges do exist in the real world, and they're different than, say, the fiber optic cables that keep the internet going, which are different than, say, the ISPs that keep the world going, or open packages like ggplot, which are necessary for all of science, but don't necessarily run all the time, but without which things are really bad. Can you clarify to me, just because there's so many people in the space working on things like literacy or internet access for underprivileged groups or fighting Comcast, what do you define as infrastructure per se?
Yeah, that's another one of those definitions where we're saying this is a spectrum and not a binary again, right? And so in IOI's context specifically, again, because of our focus, research and scholarship, we are thinking about sort of services and technologies that researchers and scholars would need to use, would rely on in order to conduct their research and do their work. That is a very broad definition, and it is defined that way because, again, it is that question, rely upon by whom and by how many, right? Some of these questions, at least, are a lot of times asked by ourselves and our community. If we take the road and bridges analogy, right, it's easy to think of a highway, let's say, being important because there are loads of cars traveling on it every day. And if it shuts down, then loads of people can't get to places fast. But what about a road that leads to a remote village and is the only road for the people in that village to get out into town? Is that infrastructure for whom? And so we try to take a more nuanced view here. And I think that has resonated in many of our conversations as we speak with different stakeholders. In the research and scholarship world, this often manifests in a way, for example, with software that is used by a particular research discipline. So let's say you are in astronomy. AstroPi may be a critical package for you, but probably not for anyone else outside of astronomy. And so is that infrastructure? We would like to think so. And it's definitely infrastructure for that particular research community. And again, in thinking about where we prioritize and where we focus most of our energy, we like to think that we would prioritize technologies and services that are relied upon or are extremely important to some people, most people, in contrast with perhaps technologies that are mostly used by just one lab, for example, in an institution. But again, like it is actually very, very hard to draw those hard lines to say, okay, just because you are used by only 5 people, you're not an infrastructure.
I really liked your question around the road that goes into the forest to people living at the other end of the road. Is that infrastructure? Now, for an extractive mining community trying to access natural resources at a distance, that is definitely infrastructure. For villagers who didn't necessarily need that road to begin with, it is not infrastructure. When you're keeping all this nuance in your head, when you're saying, yes, it's infrastructure, yes, that isn't, what does that nuance look like for you? Is it, well, everything's infrastructure, but we really only give out 4 grants a year. So really it's whenever we come to those grants, whoever submits them, and that's when we decide. Or do you ever do surveys with underrepresented groups, with different types of open source maintainers to see their definitions of infrastructure and then work that into your daily work?
That's a fantastic question. At IOI, we have a very sort of privileged position, as I often see it, that we have all this time and energy and people, and we have a dedicated team that looks at open infrastructure at an ecosystem level, right? At a meta level. We spend a lot of time thinking about questions like, what is open infrastructure? What kind of open infrastructure do we want to support or do we want to work with? Is this open? Is this not open? How does that affect the work that we do or the strategy that we want to take? What should we recommend to funders in this space? What kind of best practices do we want to promote for infrastructure services who are trying to be better and to be of better service, if you will, for the community that they serve? But that's not the case for a lot of folks on the ground. If you are technology adopter, so if you are choosing to use an open source technologies versus a proprietary technology, for example, or if you're just choosing a tool that will enable you to do your work, you often don't have that space and that time to consider all of these different nuances, these different considerations, the impact of your decisions, et cetera, et cetera. This is something that motivated us to build Infra Finder, our open infrastructure discovery and evaluation tool as well, noting that this is a really, really hard and tedious process and one that a lot of people don't have enough time to spend on. All to say, I think we need to, especially as the engagement person at Invest in Open, a large part of my task is to think about how we can convey that nuance in a way that is easy to digest for the different stakeholders and enable them to be able to participate in the conversation in a meaningful way. In a way, it is in many cases acting sort of as the translator between some of the higher level thoughts and concepts and thinking that we have within the team and what we see in the broader space to examples, language that is relevant and understandable and useful for our stakeholders. And so, for example, you asked whether or not we have consulted the community and work with them to, for example, decide which projects to fund or how best we can build tools and products and research that addresses their need. In many times, it's not asking, we have done that. And in many times, it's not asking the questions of, oh, what do you think is open infrastructure? It's asking, what do you need? And let them sort of tell the story in their own words and then interpret that into something that we can then sort of parcel down and work with. One example of that is last year when we ran the Open Infrastructure Fund, which is one of our funding pilots with really an aim to test out ways to shift powers in funding decision-making, as well as to increase the accessibility of funding to low and middle income economies in particular. We ran an open sort of funding design survey, which everyone can fill in. One of the questions that we asked were, in working with your communities, where do you see the most urgent needs in terms of additional funding for the sustainability and resilience of open infrastructure? So we saw in our research things like strengthening community governance being an area that is massively underfunded. And we knew that just asking that would mean a lot of different things to different people. Not to mention that on top of that, we do have sort of a cultural and geographical intention there, right? To be able to speak across different geographies and borders. So to be able to make the survey instrument and also the language more understandable, we listed specific examples of what that work would look like to give people more context, something tangible that they can interact with. So we're still trying out different ways to be able to do this and to facilitate that feedback and that engagement in a way that would be both useful and valuable for the participating communities, but also something that we can then learn from and work with within the team and with others who are working sort of in the same place as we are in terms of getting that sort of ecosystem level understanding of open infrastructure.
One of the ways that you talk to potential funders and just externalize your findings is in reports. I know that you have a report that came out recently or is coming out. When is the actual date this thing is being launched?
Be launched on May 28th.
May 28th. So 2 days after you may be listening to this podcast. This is the State of Open Infrastructure 2024 report. Tell me about this report.
So the State of Open Infrastructure 2024 is Invest in Open Infrastructure's first report, flagship report. We are intending this to be an annual exercise so that it becomes a resource that the community and the broader space of open infrastructure stakeholders can rely on and to understand the open infrastructure landscape in a holistic way year after year. In our first version, we have chosen to cover a variety of topics that we think would be informative and interesting and useful for our community. And these are all the way from characteristics of open infrastructures that we've chosen to analyze to funding. And in particular, we analyzed $415 million of grant funding for this particular iteration of the report. We also looked at interesting and important topics in the space, such as the governance of open infrastructure, some of the trends in the performance and adoption of open infrastructure, as well as policy developments around the world that has potential implications for open infrastructure. The report is the result of research work that we've been doing over the past couple of years, but in particular, we have, as a starting point, utilized a lot of the data that we have collected from open infrastructure services through Infra Finder, which is our open infrastructure discovery and evaluation tool. So in that tool, which we launched in April 2024, we featured data from 57 open infrastructure services. And so that data within Infra Finder is used to inform adopters and users of open infrastructure services to help them make decisions. We've also, in this report, utilized that data to be able to more broadly understand some of the trends and the gaps and the opportunities within the open infrastructure space. So we are very excited about the data that we have collected, and all of the data is also being shared openly via Zenodo, which is an open data repository. So anyone else who wants to analyze the data can sort of download it and do their own analysis. We also will have 2 data dashboards that will come out together with the report, and that will provide an interactive interface for people to sort of explore and query the data further. And that includes the grant funding data that I've just mentioned, as well as the characteristics data. And then the other thing that we really want to be able to do, and would love to hear your feedback on, it's a report. So there's a lot of insights, a lot of text that is based on sort of really rigorous data analysis and investigations. But what we really wanted to do is also to make sure that we are sort of digesting that and illustrating some of the key recommendations and findings in a way that would allow funders, adopters, services and technologies to be able to take those insights and to act on them, essentially, and to be able to make informed decisions or be able to mitigate their own risk, or to understand how perhaps they can sort of change their behaviors or make strategic plans according to some of the upcoming changes in the policy landscape, et cetera, et cetera. So based on our engagement and based on our research, the evidence that we've gathered from our engagement and research, but at the same time, this is the first time we've done this. So we'd love to hear whether this has been useful for you and whether there are additional questions and areas that we should be focusing on in order to make this report, this resource, more useful for the broader community.
So I have a copy of the report here. This thing is awesome in its scope. I don't know how you're going to do a 90-page report annually. Mad props and good luck. It's very ambitious and cool, but it's great to see such a thorough writing from the get-go. It's also great to see this on Zenodo and to be out there and published. This is amazing. One of my main questions while I'm looking at the text of the report, while I'm thinking about what this means for Invest in Open and what this means for open infrastructure at scale, is who is this report for? It's for funders. I get that. And I know that funders are very important TM people, but it doesn't seem to me to be directed directly towards, say, a maintainer of an open source project that's being used for infrastructure. It seems to me to be a policy initiative that may be useful for people who are interested in the high stakes games of where do I fit within the entire ecosystem and how can I better understand my place within geopolitical networks so I can position myself accordingly. And maybe not for those people who are like, I have 5 PRs to merge. Is that a naive assumption I'm making? Or can you talk a bit more about how this may be relevant to open source maintainers as a whole?
Absolutely. Yeah. I do think that, as you said, a hugely ambitious report. We covered a lot of ground. Funders is definitely one of our main audiences because we have invested our name. And so that's also one of the main reasons we exist, is to be able to sort of bridge and communicate between funders and maintainers and users, etc. And so there are sections that are very oriented towards funders and those who have budgets. And you should definitely read the report if you're those people. But we also actually learned a lot in working with Infra Finder, for example, but also working on the characteristics chapter of this report in particular, how this could be potentially useful for maintainers and for those who are developing, building, running, implementing open infrastructures. So in the characteristics of selected open infrastructure chapter, we go into a lot of depth, again, based on the data that we've collected from 57 infrastructure service providers. We go into a lot of depth around what do they look like? And how do we describe what open infrastructure look like? So we focused on a number of different sort of aspects and attributes, things like whether or not open infrastructures have, for example, good community governance. Now, then the next question is, what is good community governance? And there we sort of did the analysis, but also the data collection and the analysis on, for example, how many open infrastructures within the ones that we analyze have user contribution pathways and how many have what different types of user contribution pathways. The other example that I can give here is, for example, how many of them have an open product roadmap? How many of them have open APIs? All of these different aspects of, again, things going back to what we were talking about earlier about the spectrumness of open infrastructures, the different types of behaviors, if you will, or attributes that infrastructures have when they are open and community driven. We're choosing to highlight the numbers and through these figures, be able to tell the story of, okay, this is why open infrastructures are special, because a lot of them, for example, have strong commitments to having community contribution pathways, having open and transparent policies, having things like open APIs and open product roadmaps. And in that sense, if you are a maintainer, or if you are someone who is contributing, like a contributor or a developer for an open infrastructure, you could look at this and say, we don't currently have a diversity, equity, and inclusivity statement. Maybe that's something that we can work on as an infrastructure. And we've seen that as well when we were collecting this data and working with the infrastructures to put together the data, is that when we send out the intake form to ask them to tell us, give us this data, they were like, okay, hang on, we don't have this, but we would love to have it. And let's put it on our agenda and our roadmap to be able to build these policies, these pathways to engage the community. And we've recently also published 2 blog posts on our website, and the third will come, which we call Infra Finder Spotlight, where we specifically interviewed 3 infrastructures that were participating in this data collection process and have them tell the story of how they've learned from that process of working with us, being part of Infra Finder and being part of State of Open Infrastructure Report. So this is one of the ways that we envision maintainers and those who are sustaining and developing infrastructures can use some of the insights from the report. If you are a maintainer and you're reading this report, then we'd love to know how we can make it more useful for you as well.
I was about to take issue with you using the word spotlight too, but then I realized that Caitlin Taney is the person who worked at the Boston Globe who said it was okay for me to use spotlight to begin with. So That's great. Good for you. That's cool. Interesting. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. My next question. A lot of open source practitioners, a lot of open source projects don't know that they could be considered as infrastructure. You mentioned it's important to tell the story of infrastructures. I completely agree. How are you helping people come and tell their own stories through this report or through your work? And how are you reaching out to people who don't even think of themselves as infrastructure? Obviously, coming on award-winning, fantastic, multi-billion-dollar podcast is one of the ways you do that. I like winning awards. We should win more awards.
Yeah, maybe we should build like a infrastructure award.
Wait a minute. Am I infrastructure? just to be clear, am I a caryatid? Should I be worried?
That is a great question. What makes this report so unique? I mean, I know that I am biased because obviously I've been working with the team on this report for a long time, but I do think that this is something that is, again, something quite special about IOI and the lens that we have on looking at this landscape is that we often want to just ask those questions to challenge some of the assumptions that we have when it comes to what does it mean in infrastructure. The example that I would give here within this report is what does it mean sustainability? And bringing that in because this podcast is related to sustainability and has sustain in its name. And one of the areas that we've really wanted to at least try to raise that question and sort of get the readers and the broader community to think along with us and to sort of all have that aha moment to challenge ourselves in thinking about is what does success and sustainability mean for open infrastructure? And in that section in particular, we've chosen to work with a couple of open infrastructures or technologies and services to sort of highlight the stories and to give them space to almost tell the story of sustainability in their own words. That section is specifically within the chapter that is called the Trends in Open Infrastructure Performance and Adoption. And the section is called Graceful Transitions. So one of the motivations behind this is really that we've noticed that a lot of organizations, infrastructures, et cetera, goes through organizational transitions such as leadership changes, ending of partnerships, and other sort of big funding or personnel or organizationally related changes that don't often get talked about in the open. We often focus in the annual reports and the grant proposals on like, oh, we've got this new funding or we've hit this new usage milestone or how many stars we have on GitHub, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't talk enough publicly about things like we spend a lot of time preparing for and navigating this particular time that our founder decided to leave the organization, or that a 5-year partnership is coming to an end. And again, our team internally has spent a lot of time to make sure that as that was happening, our services keep running and we are continuing to operate in a community aligned fashion. These things don't get talked about enough, but it's critical, in our opinion, to what we think of as success and sustainability, actually, because open infrastructure and one of the hallmarks of open infrastructure is open infrastructure's ability to evolve and respond to the needs of the community. And so it is natural and healthy that infrastructures go through these transitions. And so we should be talking about them more and sort of exchanging knowledge around how we can help each other navigate these sort of changes, as opposed to sort of shoving it under under the cupboard and never talk about it openly, except in one-on-one conversation with someone that you're really friends with and trying to sort of understand how you could sort of navigate your way out of it. And at the risk of perhaps the broader community considering that this is a big sort of failure or challenge to your sustainability. I feel like this is not a direct answer to your question, but I think what I'm trying to say is that we are hoping to, in this report, not only show the sort of quantitative and big numbers and data, which is a part of this report. I think it's an important part of this report, and we are building out those data sets, which we hoped would be valuable to the community, but also create those space to have more of those, again, nuanced conversations that are actually important. And in thinking about how do we get more services and software to consider themselves as infrastructure, perhaps. Like this may be something that we actually want to do more of and more intentionally in the next report. And I would be curious to see how, again, the broader community let us know how we can bring more of that to light and highlight sort of not only how people are already doing this, how they are going through that journey, but also what would you want to change in the broader space in order for you to feel recognized as an infrastructure or to make that a little bit easier for you.
I like that. I also like what you said about individuals talking with their friends. That's the only time you talked about wound down partnerships. It's very similar to, say, projects on open source that you just decided not to work with anymore. Of course, conversations with friends are places where you're able to be vulnerable. And vulnerability comes from having emotional connection to things. And so a lot of the times it comes down to personal relationships to projects and partnerships and people. And I wish there was more out there to help talk about the personal costs and strategies needed to navigate through the emotional landscape of ending an open source project or moving on to a different one. These are all things that affect us because we're all human. And humans are all, in a certain sense, pretty weird creatures.
That's related to the way that we build infrastructures, right? And it should be in the underlying scaffold and matter of an infrastructure are humans. And so take whatever you would like from that. But I think that as much as this report is going to be in print and to be in text and in figures and in data, what we ultimately want to do is to encourage a conversation, knowing that we've only really touched like the tip of the iceberg for a lot of this deep, broad, nuanced topics and so many directions that we go into. So I do have a very explicit invitation here, which is now that the report is out in the public, we are going to be hosting a series of community conversations around each of the chapters that are within the report. So one session on the characteristics, one on grant funding, et cetera, et cetera. These will be monthly. If you are interested in participating, joining us online, we have a link where you can sign up to a State of OI specific mailing, and we will be updating everyone as we know when those sessions are happening. The first session is actually in June, I believe on the 18th of June. Don't quote me on that, please. Check our website and subscribe to the mailing for the accurate information and the registration link. We'll be talking about characteristics of selected open infrastructures to start with, and we look forward to having that conversation with the broader community.
Please be sure to share this on the Sustain channels as well. Put it on the Discourse. I'd love to be able to share this more widely. Where can people find this report on the interwebs?
You can find, read, and give us feedback on the report. It is available on our website, investinopen.org. The report link itself is specifically the title of the report. So State of Open Infrastructure 2024 with hyphens in between. If you put that after investinopen.org, then that will get you straight to the front page of the report. Again, like here, I would really, really emphasize and ask for your kind feedback to help us improve the next iteration of this report. There is a feedback form available at the bottom of each of the chapters. So you can tell us what question you would love being answered in the next iteration. You can tell us how useful the report is, the particular chapter is, and all of that feedback would really, really help us, not only in the building of the next iteration of this report, but in general, the direction of our research as well.
And that link will be shared in the podcast notes. Emmy, thank you so much for coming on today. Where can people learn more about you on the internet? Where are you on the social medias, et cetera, et cetera?
I am on LinkedIn, Mastodon, and unfortunately still on X. You can also reach me by email, and I would be more than happy to connect with everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. It's really great to hear about this report. Really great to hear about IOI's amazing work. Don't leave yet. As we referenced in the show, this is the part where we get to do Spotlight, which I believe Caitlin Taney did say I was allowed to use that accent only for that word, which is very exciting. So Spotlight's where we highlight people, projects, places, things that we feel need some light shed on them. My spotlight today is going to be the big year that flew by Arjan Dwarsus, whose name I just destroyed because I do not speak Dutch, probably unlike Emmy, but that's just how it goes for me. And this is a book written by a Dutch birder. The Dutch birders are fanatics, which is ridiculous and awesome. And Arjan famously saw the most birds possible within 1 year, following up on Noah Stryker's big year in 2016. In 2017, he went out, maybe the next year, he went out and saw even more birds, and he wrote a book about it. So I highly suggest checking out that book. It's a fun insight into Dutch birding and world birding, which is all of our shared heritage. Emmy, what is your spotlight today?
Yeah, I don't know if they actually need more light, but I'm going to give them a shout out anyway. There's this funding program called the Digital Infrastructure Insights Fund, which I think a lot of listeners would be familiar with, but they do have an RFP, a request for proposal, open until June 2nd. And the reason I'm highlighting this is because I think that research into the digital infrastructure landscape is really important, as evidenced by the last an hour of talking. So really wanted to applaud the fact that there are additional funding coming to this area, but also just appreciating the sort of reports and outcomes that have come out from projects that have been funded over the past 3 RFPs. They are incredible resources. We have referenced them a lot internally. And if you are working on a research project that is in this area of digital infrastructure and trying to understand this landscape a little bit better with all of us, then I strongly suggest that you check it out and apply by June 2nd.
Do that. Thank you, Emmy, so much for coming on. Thank you, listeners, for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, there's a few things you can do for us. 1, you can go and read the report online. We've already talked about that enough. 2, you can go to discourse.oss.org or podcast.oss.org or just oss.org to learn more about our social media channels, our discourse, and of course, the podcast and the show notes for Emmy's stuff. So definitely do check those out. Wherever you've listened to this podcast, please like it. Whoever you're sitting next to on the train, bus, automobile, or hydroplane, please let them know they should listen to this podcast, particularly if they're interested. Otherwise, stop talking. If you want to donate to this podcast, we would highly appreciate it. As I said earlier, we are not award-winning, but we totally should be. So also submit it to awards. Never said that before, but why not? That'd be really great. And in general, continue being awesome, amazing humans who bring your best selves, even when you're listening to podcasts. That's how awesome you are as listeners. Emmy, thank you so much once again. I hope you have a wonderful day and good luck with the report. I'm glad that it'll be out when this podcast comes out, and I'm looking forward to having other people read it and engage. Thank you.
Thank you so much.